If you could step back in time, just for one night and walk the quiet corridors of Hampton Court Palace when the torches flicker low and the portraits seem to watch with knowing eyes, would you take that chance? That is exactly what we are going to do tonight. This will not be a tale told with thunder or judgment, no sudden shocks or dramatic music to pull you from your rest. And before you wonder, no, this is not the other Boleyn girl, at least not the version where everyone wears, and probably clean gowns and argues in dimly lit hallways about who gets to wear the slightly less uncomfortable crown. There will be no slow-motion walks through wheat fields. No dramatic glances across banquet tables set with suspiciously modern cutlery, and absolutely no sisters dramatically whispering secrets while standing too close to open windows in January. Instead, you will feel the cold breath of stone passageways beneath vaulted ceilings, hear the distant echo of footsteps that have never truly faded, and stand where 6 women once stood, each carrying a dream that the wind carried away too soon. If you love stories that let you breathe the same air as history, if you have ever wondered what it felt like to live not just in an era, but within its silence, its longing, its quiet courage, then I hope you'll stay with me until the end. If you're here for the first time, thank you for finding this place. If you've been here before, welcome back. Whether you listen from a city wrapped in light, from a village under open stars, or from a room where rain taps softly against the window, know that you are not alone.
Ow.
This space belongs to those who believe that history is not only written in books, but also whispered in candlelight, carried in memory, felt in the stillness between heartbeats. And if, as you drift towards sleep, you find a moment that moves you, if a name, a gesture, a single sentence lingers in your mind, perhaps you'd be willing to share it when you wake, not because you must, but because sometimes saying a feeling out loud gives it wings. And if you haven't yet subscribed, or if you'd like to return again, know that every time you listen, you'll help keep these quiet stories alive. Not for fame, not for noise, but for the ones who were never given a voice. What you are about to hear is not merely a chronicle of kings and queens. It is a lullaby for the forgotten hearts of the Tudor court, a gentle journey through candlelight and memory. And it begins right now. The year does not matter here. Exact date is long since dissolved into dust. What matters is the weight of winter in the air, kind that settles deep into your bones and makes you crave the warmth of a fire, the softness of wool, the sound of a voice speaking softly in the dark. Outside, snow falls gently over the gardens of Greenwich, blanketing the hedges and statues in silence. Frost climbs the windows like delicate lace, turning the world beyond into a blur of silver and shadow. Inside, the palace breathes slowly, as if it too is drifting towards sleep. Candles burn low in iron sconces along the walls, their flames trembling slightly whenever a door creaks open somewhere down the hall. The scent of beeswax and old wood fills the air, mixed with the faintest trace of rosewater left behind by hands that passed through hours ago. Somewhere deep within the heart of the building, a servant stirs the coals in a distant fireplace, and the soft clink of iron against stone echoes like a secret being shared. This is not a place of celebration tonight. No musicians play in the great hall, no laughter rings from the royal chambers. It is late, past midnight perhaps, and the palace belongs now to shadows, to memories, for the ones who are no longer remembered by name, but whose presence still lingers in the grain of the floorboards, in the turn of a key, in the way the light falls across an empty chair. At the center of it all, though he may already be asleep, though his snores may rumble behind heavy tapestries, is him, Henry. Not the king tonight, not the eighth, not the tyrant, or the reformer, or the legend. Just Henry, a man, steady in body, heavier in soul, a boy once full of promise, now wrapped in ermine and disappointment, dreaming perhaps of sons who never lived, of loves that turned to dust, of a youth he could no longer reach. But this story, this quiet journey through the halls of time, is not really about him. It is about them. The 6 women who walked these corridors in silk and fear and hope and silence, who wore crowns that weighed more than gold, who smiled when they were expected to, prayed when they were afraid, and loved some of them deeply, some of them cautiously, knowing how easily such things could be taken away. Catherine of Aragon arrived with the sun of Spain still on her skin, knelt before altars, and said, "I am his true wife," until her last breath. And Boleyn had dark eyes and a sharper wit, danced like fire and vanished like smoke. Jane Seymour was pale and gentle, gave him the son he wanted, and paid for it with her life. Anne of Cleves came from across the sea, survived by choosing peace over power. Catherine Howard was young and trembling, learned too late that desire can be dangerous. Catherine Parr was the scholar, the healer, the one who held the pieces together when the storm had finally passed. Each of them entered this world with a name, a family, a heartbeat. Each of them left it changed, some by death, some by exile, all by history. And tonight we remember them, not as wives, not as numbers, but as women. As people who woke in the morning wondering if they were safe, who touched their necks when rumors spread, who looked into mirrors and asked, "Do I please him?" Who wrote letters they were not sure would be read, who loved their children, their faith, their freedom when they still had any of those things. So if you are ready, close your eyes now, let your breath slow, feel the warmth of your blankets like a velvet cloak. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a grand staircase, dressed not in modern clothes, but in something soft, warm, timeless. You are not a visitor here. You are not a judge. You are simply present. As the wind whispers through the chimneys and the candles dip into pools of wax, let yourself be carried not forward, but back, into candlelight, into silence, to the long, quiet breath between one heartbeat and the next. The past does not shout. It waits. It listens. And sometimes it speaks in whispers. Listen closely, breathe slowly, and let us begin. We are walking now through a corridor lined with tapestries of hunting scenes and saints. The air is cool. Your footsteps do not echo. The walls are thick, the stones old. Ahead, a single torch burns behind glass. Someone moved through here recently. You can still feel the ghost of their passing. Somewhere a woman is writing by candlelight. Her hand trembles slightly. She does not know it yet, but her story is about to begin. Imagine a morning in early spring across the rolling hills of Surrey, where the air carries the scent of damp earth and wild blossoms, where mist lingers in the valleys like a soft blanket refusing to rise. The sun climbs slowly behind thin clouds, casting a pale gold light over fields where sheep graze quietly and birds hop between hedgerows in search of twigs and seeds. In a small village below, a blacksmith opens his forge, the first sparks flying like tiny stars against the cooling dark. A woman draws water from the well, her breath visible in the crisp air. And inside cottages with thatched roofs, families gather around fires, warming their hands before beginning the day. This is England before the weight of change, before the turning of tides. When life moved with the rhythm of seasons and not the urgency of power. There are no clocks here, no schedules marked by bells or whistles, only the natural passage of time measured by the crowing of roosters. The shifting light on wooden walls, and the slow arc of the sun across the sky. People wake when their bodies tell them it is time, eat when hunger comes, and sleep when darkness settles like a familiar guest. The world feels close, intimate, as if every person knows their place within it, not because they were told, but because they have always felt it in their bones. Children learn not from books, but from watching. From walking beside their parents through orchards and pastures, from learning the names of plants, the habits of animals, the way rain falls differently in April than in May. There is hardship, yes, in the ache of long labor and the fear of winter's cold, but there is also a deep sense of belonging. A quiet certainty that even in struggle, one is part of something older and larger than oneself. The River Thames flows wide and steady through London, its surface dark and reflective. Broken only by the slow passage of wooden boats carrying goods from distant towns. Gulls cry overhead, circling above the docks where sailors unload barrels of wine, bales of wool, and crates of spices wrapped in cloth. The city stirs gently, not with haste, but with purpose. Cobblestones glisten from last night's rain. Shop doors creak open one by one. And the smell of baking bread drifts from ovens tucked beneath narrow houses. Children run barefoot through alleys, laughing without knowing they are poor, while merchants greet each other by name, their voices blending into the quiet hum of a world that still feels small enough to understand. The streets are narrow, winding, built over centuries without plan or symmetry. Yet they carry the pulse of daily life with a kind of gentle order. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin gray spirals that twist into the sky before vanishing. And the sound of footsteps echoes softly against stone walls, absorbed quickly by the thick air of early morning. Inside taverns warmed by glowing hearths, men sip ale and speak in low tones about the harvest, the weather, the latest news from court. Though such news reaches them slowly, filtered through travelers and letters that take days to arrive, there is no rush to know everything at once. Rumors move like rivers, bending and widening as they go, shaped more by imagination than fact. And so, life unfolds without the pressure of immediacy. A letter may take weeks, a journey months, a decision years. But in this slowness, there is space for thought, for feeling, for simply being present in a moment that does not demand to be recorded or shared. The city breathes at its own pace, neither fast nor slow, but steady, like the tide that pulls the river seaward each day, then returns it with equal calm. And within the walls of Richmond Palace, surrounded by gardens trimmed with hedges and lined with fruit trees just beginning to bloom, lives a young prince who has not yet learned what it means to rule. He is tall and strong, with fair hair that catches the sunlight and eyes the color of summer sky. He moves with ease, as though his body knows joy better than sorrow. He loves music more than silence, dance more than stillness, and the thrill of riding at full speed across open fields where the wind rushes past his ears like a song. When he plays the lute in the great hall, the courtiers pause to listen, not because he is royal, but because there is sincerity in his touch, a kind of honesty that cannot be taught. He spends hours in the chapel not out of duty, but because he finds peace in the quiet, in the flicker of candlelight on stained glass. It's in the way the Latin prayers roll like waves against the stone walls. He reads books brought from Italy and France, volumes of poetry and philosophy bound in leather, their pages filled with ideas about beauty, virtue, and the nature of happiness. He underlines passages with a delicate hand, sometimes writing notes in the margins, questions more than answers, as if trying to shape a self through words left behind by others. He walks through the palace corridors late at night, when most have retired, wrapped in a woolen cloak, drawn to the silence, to the way moonlight falls across the floor in long rectangles, to the distant sound of a servant humming a tune while cleaning silverware. He notices small things, the pattern of dust on a windowsill, the way a dog sleeps, curled near the kitchen fire, the expression on a guard's face when he thinks no one is looking. These moments stay with him, not because they matter to history, but because they feel real, true, untouched by performance. He wears fine clothes, yes, velvet doublets in deep reds and greens, boots polished to shine like water, but he removes them willingly after a tournament, walking barefoot on cool grass, just to feel the earth beneath his feet. He laughs loudly, not to impress, but because something struck him as truly funny. He writes poetry in a small leather-bound book, verses about love and nature, lines that will never be published, never read by scholars, but kept because they belong to a version of himself he hopes never fades. He dances with ladies of the court, not to claim them, but to share in the movement, in the music, in the fleeting connection of two people moving in harmony. He remembers their names, asks after their families, listens when they speak, even when others would interrupt. There is no arrogance in his presence, only a kind of radiant curiosity, as if the world is still new to him, still full of wonder. He hunts not for trophies, but for the experience of the crisp morning air, the rustle of leaves, the sudden stillness before the deer appears. He respects the animal, says a quiet word before the shot, and ensures its meat is used, never wasted. He is not perfect. He can be impulsive, impatient at times, quick to anger when betrayed, but those moments pass like storms in spring, brief and followed by clarity. What remains is a man who believes in honor, not as a rule, but as a way of living, who sees leadership not as domination, but as responsibility, who dreams of a kingdom where justice is not rare, where the arts are cherished, where faith brings comfort rather than fear. He does not yet know how heavy a crown can feel, how quickly trust can turn to betrayal, how often love becomes a tool rather than a gift. He does not know that one day he will be remembered not for his kindness, not for his music, not for his laughter, but for the women whose lives pass through his hands like sand through fingers. Beyond the sea, in a land of bright sun and red stone, a young woman waits. She came from Spain years ago, sent across the ocean to marry his older brother, Arthur, who died too soon, leaving her stranded in a foreign court. Caught between duty and uncertainty, her name is Catherine Alda. She is devout, gentle, and resilient. She prays daily, not out of habit, but because she believes someone listens. She wears dark colors even when others wear silk and gold, not to mourn but to remember who she is beneath the titles. She speaks Latin and Greek, reads the church fathers, and keeps a small copy of the Bible beside her bed, its pages worn from nightly reading. She walks with her back straight, not from pride, but from discipline, from a lifetime of knowing that every step is watched, every gesture interpreted. She is not beautiful in the way courts celebrate her features are strong. Her nose prominent, her eyes serious, but there is a depth in her gaze that stays with those who meet her. She cares for the sick, visits nuns in convents, writes letters to her family with careful penmanship, expressing both loyalty and loneliness. She waits not passively, but with purpose, believing that God has a plan, even when the path is unclear. She does not seek power for its own sake, but she will not surrender dignity, not even to kings. No one knows yet how their lives will twist together, how a simple marriage, arranged for political peace, will ignite a fire that reshapes a nation. No one sees the years of longing, the whispered arguments, the silent tears shed in candlelit rooms. Not here, not now. For this moment, the world remains whole. The prince dances, the river flows. The sun rises and sets without warning. In the great halls of Westminster, where tapestries hang from ceiling to floor, and the scent of beeswax fills the air, life unfolds in layers of ritual and routine. Servants move silently across wide floors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets woven in Flanders, their arms laden with fresh linens, trays of fruit, vases filled with early roses. The king, Henry VII, sits in his private chamber, reviewing ledgers by candlelight, his face lined with the weight of having built a kingdom from war. He speaks little, observes much, and rules with caution, preferring stability over spectacle. The court around him is rich but restrained, opulent but controlled, aware that peace is fragile and must be guarded like a flame in the wind. Yet beneath this careful order, there is a current of anticipation, a quiet sense that something is shifting. The old ways are still honored, the Mass said at dawn, the processions on feast days, the strict hierarchy of rank, but new ideas drift in from the continent. Carried by diplomats, artists, and students returning from universities in Paris and Padua, there is talk of humanism, of rediscovered texts, of a world where reason and beauty might walk beside faith. These ideas do not shout, they whisper like wind through curtains, barely noticed at first, but slowly changing the atmosphere of the rooms where decisions are made and futures imagined. At court, music is not mere entertainment, but a language of emotion and diplomacy. Lutenists play in alcoves during supper, their melodies weaving through conversations like threads of silver. Dancers move in precise formations, their steps rehearsed for weeks, their gestures meaning more than words. A glance, a bow, the way a hand is offered, or withdrawn all of it, speaks volumes in a world where direct speech is often dangerous.
Ow.
Young noblewomen practice embroidery not just to pass the time, but to demonstrate patience, precision, and obedience. Their needles trace flowers and saints onto linen, stitch by tiny stitch, each loop a silent prayer for grace, for favor, for survival in a game they did not choose. Men train in swordplay and horsemanship, not only for war, but to show strength, control, and confidence. Honor is measured not by victories, but by how one bears defeat, how one treats inferiors, how one faces uncertainty. It is a world governed by appearances, yes, but also by an unspoken code that values restraint, loyalty, and inner composure. To lose one's temper in public is to reveal weakness. To weep openly is to invite suspicion. And so emotions are folded inward, stored in diaries, hidden in poems, released only in the privacy of a chamber after midnight, when the candles burn low and the guards have changed shift. The seasons mark the rhythm of court life with quiet authority. Winter brings long nights, lit by firelight, when stories are told and fortunes read by candle glow. Spring arrives with tournaments held on green fields outside Greenwich, where knights in polished armor charge at each other with lances, not to kill, but to prove skill, courage, and devotion. Summer fills the gardens with fragrance and song, as musicians perform beneath shaded arbors and couples stroll along gravel paths bordered by lavender and rosemary. Autumn brings the harvest feasts, tables groaning under roasted meats, spiced wines and golden bread, when even the poorest servants are given extra rations in a moment to celebrate. Each season carries its own mood, its own light, its own way of shaping memory. And through it all, the church remains a constant presence, not only in doctrine, but in daily structure. Bells call people to prayer at fixed hours, their chimes echoing across rooftops and riverbanks, marking time like a heartbeat. Births are blessed, marriage is sanctified, deaths mourned with ritual and care. Death is not hidden here. It is expected, accepted, prepared for. But neither is it feared beyond measure, for there is comfort in the belief that what ends here continues elsewhere, in a realm beyond the reach of kings and wars. Yet, beneath this surface of order and tradition, there is a quiet awareness that nothing lasts forever. The elderly king grows weaker, his cough deeper each winter. The prince, though beloved, is still untested. The question of succession hangs in the air like incense after mass presence, sacred, rarely spoken aloud. There are whispers among the nobles, glances exchanged over goblets of wine, alliances forming and dissolving like mist at dawn. Some look towards Spain, hoping for a strong alliance through marriage. Others watch France, calculating threats and opportunities. A few, very few, dare to imagine a future where the church itself might change, where power could shift in ways no one has yet named. But these thoughts remain hidden, folded into private letters sealed with wax, burned after reading. For now, the world holds its breath. The gardens bloom, the rivers flow, the candles burn, and the young prince rides through the countryside with his friends, unaware that one day every choice he makes will ripple outward, touching lives he will never meet, altering histories he cannot foresee. And if you listen closely, you can hear the quiet hum of ordinary life, the rustle of fabric, the crackle of fire, the distant chime of a bell marking the hour. This is the world before everything changed, a time when hope was still easy, when futures seemed certain, when the only shadows were those cast by trees in the afternoon light. There are no omens here, no signs written in the stars, no voices warning of what is to come. Only the soft rhythm of existence, the turning of pages, the brushing of a horse's mane, the folding of a letter sealed with wax. This is the beginning not of drama, not of tragedy, but of a story carried forward by real hearts, real choices, real breaths drawn in rooms long since fallen silent. It is a world that believed in continuity, in tradition, in the idea that things would remain as they had always been. And in that belief there was a kind of pisa fragile. Temporary pisa rested not on power, but on the simple act of waking up each day and trusting that tomorrow would resemble today. As the years pass slowly through the corridors of Richmond and Greenwich, a quiet shift begins to settle over the court. Not with announcement or decree, but in the way candlelight flickers before it dims. The prince is now king, crowned beneath vaulted ceilings where incense rises like memory. His hand heavy on the orb, his voice echoing in Latin as oaths are sworn. Yet the change feels less like a transformation and more like a slow settling, as if the world has simply exhaled and taken a new shape. He wears the crown with dignity, walks with the same strength, dances at feasts with laughter still bright in his chest. But those who watch closely notice small differences, the way he pauses when a child runs past, the silence that follows when someone mentions heirs, the slight tension in his jaw when the Spanish ambassador speaks of lineage and legacy. He is no longer a boy dreaming of peace and music. He is a ruler, and rulers are measured not by their hearts, but by what they leave behind. The weight of the kingdom rests not only on his shoulders, but in the quiet spaces between his thoughts, where questions form without words. Is this enough? Will it ever be enough? And though he laughs during banquets, rides through forests with his hounds, plays music late into the night, There is a growing sense within him that something essential is missing, not in power or wealth, but in the deepest part of his purpose. The queen, once so full of hope, moves through the palace with a grace that hides exhaustion. Catherine carries herself as she always has, back straight, voice steady, hands folded in prayer each morning. But there is a thinness around her eyes now, a weariness that even the finest silks cannot conceal. She has given birth many times, or tried to, and each time the court holds its breath. Each time the chapels fill with whispered prayers, each time the midwives enter her chambers with solemn faces, and each time the news comes quietly, spoken in corners. Another stillbirth, another fever, another tiny coffin carried away before sunrise. The king visits her after each loss, sits beside her bed, takes her hand, says words meant to comfort. But neither of them can ignore the growing silence between them, the unspoken question that hangs like smoke above the hearth. Is this a punishment? Is God turning away? Or is it simply that fate has other plans, cruel and unseen? She does not blame him. She does not weep in his presence. But at night, alone with her maid, she allows herself one moment of weakness, a single tear traced down her cheek, quickly wiped away as she looks at the empty cradle standing in the corner, covered now with a white cloth like an altar between two worlds. In the gardens where roses bloom in summer and ivy clings to stone walls in winter, conversations begin to change. Servants speak in low tones while folding linens or polishing silver. Not of treason or rebellion, but of possibility. What if there is no sun? What if the line ends here? These are not rebellious thoughts, only human ones, born from centuries of knowing that without an heir, kingdoms tremble. The nobles do not shout these concerns. They let them drift into speeches about stability, about alliances, about the future of England. A portrait of Prince Arthur, long dead, hangs in a shadowed hall, his face pale and serious, a reminder of what was lost too soon. And now, another absence looms, one not yet realized, but feared all the same. The weight of expectation rests not on one person, but on an entire nation breathing quietly, waiting for a cry from a newborn that never comes. Even the priests, during Mass, seem to linger longer on certain passages about barren women made fertile, about kings chosen by divine will. The air itself feels heavier, as if the sky were holding its breath, waiting for a sign, for a turn, for something to break the stillness. It is during one of these fragile moments, as autumn leaves fall across the courtyards and fires are lit earlier each evening, that a young woman returns from France. Her name is Anne. She does not arrive with fanfare or royal procession, but quietly, almost unnoticed, slipping back into the orbit of court life, like a note reintroduced into a melody. She has been in the French court, serving queens and princesses, learning their manners, their fashions, their ways of speaking and moving. There she absorbed more than etiquette. She learned how power can be worn like perfume, how influence can be gained not through loudness, but through presence. When she walks into a room, people turn, not because she is the most beautiful, but because she seems fully awake, as if the world is happening through her, not around her. Her dark eyes move quickly, taking in everything: the tilt of a hat, the tone of a voice, the space between words. She does not lower her gaze as others do. She listens deeply. She remembers names. When she speaks, her voice is clear, not loud, but impossible to ignore, like water running over smooth stone. She serves the queen with proper deference, bows her head at the right moments, performs her duties without error, yet there is something different in the way she exists within the rigid structure of court life. While others speak softly and avoid attention, Anne laughs at the right moment, asks questions others would not dare, reads books in corners where few women read at all. She plays the lute with skill, sings in French and English, and when she dances, she does not merely follow steps, she seems to guide them, as if her body knows a rhythm no one else can hear. The king notices her first as a curiosity, then as a distraction, then as something deeper, though he would not name it yet. He sees how she tilts her head when listening, how she pauses before answering, how she does not flinch when met with a sharp glance. In a world built on obedience, her quiet confidence feels like a secret. He finds himself looking for her during meals, noticing which side of the hall she stands on, remembering the way she smiled once when he told a joke no one else understood. It is not passion at first, not desire in the way stories later will claim, but recognition, a sense that here is someone who sees him not as a king, but as a man with thoughts, doubts, dreams. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air in the palace begins to change. Conversations grow slightly sharper when she is near. Glances linger a moment too long. The queen senses it, not through accusation, but through the subtle withdrawal of affection. The way her husband's letters grow shorter, the way he spends more evenings in council, or so he says. There are no shouts, no confrontations, only the gradual erosion of closeness. Like water shaping stone over decades, Catherine continues her prayers, writes to her family, tends to the poor, but at night, alone in her chamber, she stares at the ceiling and listens to the distant sound of music from the great hall. Knowing that joy now lives in a place she cannot reach, she does not curse Anne. She does not speak ill of her. But sometimes, while reading scripture, her fingers pause on a passage about loyalty, about suffering in silence, and she closes the book gently, as if putting a child to sleep. The servants notice how she eats less, how she walks more slowly, how she no longer asks for new gowns. Yet she remains kind, always kind. And in that kindness there's a strength that no crown could give. Meanwhile, in the mind of the king, a thought begins to take root, not sudden, not dramatic, but persistent, like a splinter beneath the skin. Could it be that his marriage is wrong in the eyes of God? That marrying his brother's widow brought a curse upon them both? He recalls the words of Scripture, passages whispered by advisors, murmured by priests who know which winds are blowing. He thinks of David, of ancient laws, of nations rising and falling based on divine favor. He does not want to believe it, but the idea will not leave him. It returns at odd hours while hunting, while reading, while watching a sparrow feed its young in a nest outside his window. What if the answer is not in medicine or fate, but in faith? What if the solution lies not in patience, but in courage, not in staying, but in changing? He walks through the chapel at dawn when the light is soft and the candles barely burn, and kneels before the altar, not in prayer exactly, but in search of clarity. He does not ask for a son. He asks for guidance, for permission, for a sign that he is not being selfish, that he is not abandoning a good woman for the sake of his own longing. But no voice answers, only the echo of his breath against stone. Anne does not seek the king's attention, not at first. She does not scheme in the way stories later will claim. She is young, yes, full of fire and dreams, but also afraid. She has seen how quickly favor can vanish, how easily a woman can be cast aside. She remembers her cousin executed for adultery, her family's fortunes rising and falling like tides. And yet, when the king begins to write her letters, short at first, then longer, filled with verses and questions, she responds not out of ambition, but because she feels seen in a way no one has made her feel before. He speaks to her mind, not just her beauty. He asks what she thinks, what she believes, what kind of world she would build. And in those moments, something real begins to grow, fragile and dangerous, like a flower pushing through cracked stone. She reads his words by candlelight, tracing the ink with her finger, feeling the warmth of the flame on her skin. She does not tell anyone. She keeps the letters hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in linen. And when she closes her eyes at night, she does not dream of crowns or palaces, but of conversation, of being heard, truly heard, for the first time. The court does not erupt. It does not gasp or protest. Instead, it watches. And in watching, it adjusts. Some support the king, seeing in it a chance for renewal, for a fresh alliance, for a break from old ties. Others remained loyal to Catherine, moved by her dignity, her faith, her quiet endurance. But loyalty here is not shouted. It is shown in small gestures. A nod withheld, a seat left empty, a prayer said a little louder during Mass. No one draws swords, no one makes accusations. But the ground is shifting, gently, like sand beneath a tide. And everyone senses that the path ahead will not be the one they walked yesterday. The musicians play the same songs, the servants serve the same wine, the sun rises and sets as it always has. Yet something has changed in the way people move through the halls, in the way they hold their cups, in the way they avoid certain gazes. The air is warmer, somehow charged with anticipation, as if a storm were gathering far out at sea, still invisible, but felt in the bones. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, the whisper of change. It's not in thunder, not in wardrooms, but in the rustle of a letter being sealed, in the pause before a name is spoken. In the way do people look at each other across a crowded room, not with passion, but with recognition. Something is beginning, not with fire, but with breath, not with force, but with feeling. The world is still whole, the seasons still turn, the candles still burn. But deep beneath the surface, beneath the rituals and routines, beneath the silence of stone walls and sleeping gardens, a new path is forming one step at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one quiet choice at a time. No one knows where it leads. No one dares to imagine the cost. But the journey has begun, not with a shout, but with a sigh, not with violence, but with a single thought that refused to be silenced. As the winter deepens over the rooftops of Greenwich Palace, the fires burn longer in the hearths, and the corridors grow quieter, as if the very stones are holding their breath. The king no longer walks alone through the gardens at dusk. Now he is often seen with a small group of trusted advisorsmen in dark robes who speak in low voices, their hands clasped tightly around books bound in worn leather. They meet not in the great hall, where tapestries absorb sound and candles flicker above long tables, but in a private chamber tucked behind the library. A room with thick walls and a single narrow window that looks out onto a courtyard covered in frost. Here, away from eyes and ears, they discuss not war or trade, but scripture passages from Leviticus, ancient laws about marriage, forbidden unions, divine consequences. The king listens closely, his fingers tracing the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the dancing flame of a single candle. He does not interrupt, he does not argue. But something in his posture, shoulders leaning forward, breath slow and deliberate, suggests that these words are not merely being heard, but felt, weighed, stored like seeds waiting for soil. The air in the room is still, heavy with the scent of old paper and beeswax, and every pause between sentences feels like a breath held too long. No one speaks of breaking from Rome, no one says the word divorce, but the question lingers beneath every phrase, like a shadow just beyond the light. Can a marriage be undone if it was never right in the eyes of God? The queen, meanwhile, continues her daily rhythm with quiet devotion. Each morning she rises before dawn, wraps herself in a woolen cloak, and walks barefoot across the cold floor to kneel before her private altar. The scent of beeswax lingers from last night's vigil, and the Bible lies open beside a cup of water, its pages marked with a ribbon of deep red silk. She reads slowly, mouthing the words silently, pausing often, as if listening for an answer between the lines. Her maid enters quietly, places warm slippers by the bed, folds the sheets with care, but says nothing. There is no need. The silence between them is full of understanding. Catherine does not ask what the king is doing. She does not demand reports from servants or spies, yet she knows. Not through gossip, not through confrontation, but through absence, the way he no longer joins her for supper. How his letters arrive less frequently, how the space between them in chapel has grown from 1 seat to 3. Still, she lights a candle each evening for his soul, another for the kingdom, and a third for peace. Though she can no longer remember what peace feels like, and when she prays, her voice does not tremble, her hands do not shake. But sometimes after the final amen, she rests her forehead against the wooden edge of the altar and stays there, motionless, until the fire burns down to embers. As if drawing strength from the stillness itself, in the east wing of the palace, where the sun touches the windows earliest, Anne sits by a small fire, wrapped in a shawl stitched with tiny flowers. She reads too, but not scripture instead. She turns the pages of Erasmus and Thomas More, works on grace, reason, and the soul's connection to God. Her handwriting fills the margins, delicate and precise, questions forming like vines around the printed text. She does not read to defy tradition, but to understand it, to see whether faith and thought can walk together. When the king visits, he does not bring guards or fanfare, comes alone, or with only one attendant who waits outside, and they talk for hours about justice, about the poor, about how the church might serve people more directly. He speaks to her in a way he speaks to no one else, not as a ruler giving orders, but as a man searching for truth. And though she smiles, though her voice remains gentle, There is a growing awareness in her chest, like a slow tide rising. This is not just affection. This is becoming something larger than either of them. It is not power she desires, not yet, but the chance to matter, to be heard, to shape something good. To stand beside someone who sees her not as ornament, but as mind, as partner, as possibility. A letter arrives from Rome, carried by a weary courier, who collapses briefly against the stable wall, before delivering it into the hands of the archbishop. It is brief, formal, written in careful Latin. The Pope cannot grant an annulment. The marriage to Catherine was valid. To dissolve it would set a dangerous precedent. The king reads it once, then again, standing by the window, as snow begins to fall over the courtyard. His face shows no anger, no outburst, only a stillness so complete it seems unnatural. He folds the letter carefully, places it in a wooden box lined with velvet, and locks it with a small key he keeps around his neck. No one sees him do it. No one is told. But from that moment, something shifts in the way he moves through the world, as if a door has closed behind him. He now walks toward another path, one that has not yet been built. That evening, he walks through the long gallery where portraits of kings past hang in dim light, their eyes following him as he passes. He stops before one of his fathers, studies the stern expression, the tight grip on the scepter, the message of control, of order, of fear. Then he turns and walks the other way, toward the private chapel, where a single candle burns before the Virgin. He does not kneel, he only watches the flame. And in its flicker, he sees not punishment, but permission. Servants notice the change in routine. Council meetings begin earlier. New men appear at Court. Thomas Cromwell, a man with sharp eyes and a calm voice, who speaks little but observes everything. Thomas Cranmer, a scholar whose sermons carry a different tone, softer, more personal, focused on conscience rather than obedience. They do not wear armor or jewels. They do not dance at feasts. But their presence is felt, like a current beneath still water. Meanwhile, portraits of Catherine are gradually moved from central halls to smaller rooms, not removed, not destroyed, but gently set aside as one might place a beloved book back on a shelf after rereading it for the last time. No decree is issued. No scandal is named. But the silence around her grows heavier, like snow accumulating on a roof. Ladies in waiting who once gathered around her now drift toward other circles. Conversations pause when she enters. And though she carries herself with the same dignity, there is a new distance in her gaze, as if she is already living in memory. Anne does not move into the royal chambers. She does not demand titles or crowns. She begins to receive gifts books in fine bindings, a locket with a miniature painting of a falcon, her family symbol, a necklace of pearls so perfectly matched they seem born of a single moon. She accepts them with gratitude, never extravagance, always with a note of thanks written in her own hand. And when she walks through the palace now, women step slightly aside, not out of fear, but recognition. Something is changing. It's not loudly, not violently, but steadily, like the turning of seasons. She feels it too, the weight of expectation, the fragility of favor, the knowledge that everything could vanish with a single word from Rome, a single shift in mood. And so she is careful. She laughs at the right moment, bows at the right time, but never pushes. She lets the future come to her, like a river shaping its own course. One evening, during a banquet held under chandeliers lit with dozens of candles, the king raises his glass not to the queen, but to Anne, seated at a lower table among the ladies in waiting. He does not make a speech. He does not announce anything. He simply looks at her, holds the glass for a moment longer than necessary, and drinks. The hall does not erupt. No one gasps. But the silence that follows is different, thicker, charged, as if everyone has suddenly become aware of breathing. Catherine remains still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered to her plate. She finishes her meal. She thanks the musicians. She retires at the usual hour. But that night, her maid finds the third candle unlit, the one meant for peace. And the next morning, the queen asks for her riding clothes. She rides out alone, without escort, through the misty fields beyond the park, returning only when the sun is high, her face unreadable, her gloves stained with dew and crushed time. Outside the palace walls, in villages and market towns, rumors begin to drift like fog. People speak of the king's prayers, of priests whispering about a new direction for the church, of a woman from the French court who has captured not just his heart, but his purpose. These are not angry words, not yet. It's just observations, passed from neighbor to neighbor while mending clothes or tending animals. A blacksmith says he heard the king wants to read the Bible in English so all can understand it. A baker's wife claims her cousin's husband saw a monk burning old records in a cellar. Nothing is certain. But the air carries a new quality, like the moment before thunder, when the birds stop singing and the light turns gray. And in the quiet of their homes, people begin to wonder, if the king can question his marriage, what else might be questioned? If the church in Rome says no, but England says yes, who truly holds authority? Back in the king's private study, a new map is unrolled on the table, one not of battlefields or borders, but of dioceses, monasteries, and cathedral cities. Cromwell stands beside him, pointing with a slender stick, explaining how wealth flows from the church to Rome. How much could remain in England if loyalty shifted? The king listens, nods slowly, then asks a single question. Can it be done without blood? Cromwell does not answer immediately. He knows the cost of such a change, but he also knows the power of patience, of law, of small steps taken over years. He says only, "It can begin gently, Your Majesty, with words, with books, with time." And the king exhales, as if releasing a breath he has held for months. That night, he walks to the edge of the Thames, alone, watching the water carry torchlight from passing boats. He does not pray, he does not weep. But for the first time, he feels not guilt, but resolve. This is not rebellion. It is not pride. It is, in his mind, necessity, correction, a return to what is right. And if God will not act, then perhaps a king must. And if you listen closely, you can hear it the first true step forward. Not a march, not a charge, but a foot placed deliberately on uncertain ground. The creak of a door opening after years of being sealed, the scratch of a pen forming a new decree, the soft closing of a book that will not be opened again. The world has not changed yet. The Queen still prays. The sun still rises. The river still flows. But the path ahead is no longer the same. It winds into mist, into silence, into a future that no one can name, but which has already begun. And somewhere, deep within the stone heart of the kingdom, a new rhythm starts to beat, slow and steady. Like a clock wound for the first time. As winter loosens its grip on the land, and the first pale green shoots push through the damp earth in the palace gardens, a different kind of thaw begins to unfold within the walls of court, not with force or declaration, but like the slow seep of warmth into frozen stone. Imperceptible at first, yet undeniable in its persistence. The air carries a new quality, not colder, not warmer, but lighter. As if centuries of silence were beginning to lift from the corridors, allowing breath where there was only stillness before. The king no longer walks these halls with the same rhythm he once did. Steps are slower now, more deliberate, as though each one is being measured against an invisible scale. He passes beneath archways carved with Latin inscriptions about divine order and royal duty, but he does not look up. His gaze remains forward, steady, as if he sees something ahead that others cannot. In the mornings, he stands by the window of his private study, watching the mist rise from the river, his hands clasped behind his back, unmoving for long stretches of time. Servants learn not to interrupt these moments. They leave tea on a tray outside the door, untouched until hours later. No one speaks of rebellion, no one whispers treason. But in the way his advisors now gather earlier, in how their voices lower when certain books are brought out, treatises on ancient kingship, on the relationship between monarch and church, becomes clear that something is shifting, not through fire but through thought, not through war but through the quiet accumulation of questions that refuse to be ignored. In the great hall, where tapestry still depicts saints and battles from ages past, the music has changed so gradually that few can pinpoint when it began. The lutenists play melodies that feel lighter, less formal, as if the very notes are testing the air for permission to be free. Dancers move with less rigidity, their steps flowing rather than marching, and even the way wine is poured seems different, slower. It's more deliberate, as though each gesture now holds meaning beyond the moment. No one speaks openly of breaking from Rome. No proclamations are made. But in private chambers, behind closed doors, books appear that were once forbidden, translations of the Gospels into English, treatises on grace and faith written by reformers across the sea, their pages marked with marginalia in careful hand. These are read by candlelight, passed from hand to hand like secrets, their presence known but never acknowledged aloud. A young scribe copies passages late into the night, his quill scratching softly against parchment, pausing often to listen for footsteps in the corridor. He does not do this for glory. He does it because, for the first time, he believes he might understand God without needing a priest to interpret him, and when he finishes, he hides the copy beneath a loose floorboard, not out of fear, but out of reverence for knowledge, for truth, for the fragile weight of a single idea taking root in darkness. The Queen remains in her rooms, surrounded by the same objects she has known for years, the wooden crucifix above her bed, the silver comb engraved with Spanish roses, the small chest where she keeps letters from her mother, long since gone. She continues to write to Rome, her script steady, her words respectful but firm. I am his true wife. I have loved this country. I have served it faithfully. She does not sign as the divorced or the discarded, but simply as Catherine. And though her letters return unanswered or answered with cold formality, she sends them anyway. It's not because she believes they will change anything, but because to stop writing would be to surrender the last thread connecting her to a life that once made sense. Her maid notices how she touches the wedding ring each morning before removing it to wash her hands, how she pauses for just a breath longer than necessary, then places it back without a word. There is no bitterness in her voice, no anger in her prayers, only a deep, quiet sorrow that settles into the room like dust on old furniture present, noticed, impossible to fully remove. She still receives visitors, still offers counsel to young women who come seeking wisdom, still kneels at Mass with her back straight and her eyes closed. But those who know her well see the change, the way she no longer looks toward the royal seat during service, the way she leaves immediately after communion, the way she walks more slowly now, as if carrying a weight no one else can see. Meanwhile, Anne is no longer seen only among the ladies in waiting. She walks beside the king during afternoon strolls through the cloistered garden, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, her hands tucked into his arm. They do not always speak. Sometimes they simply walk, side by side, watching the swans glide across the pond, their reflections broken by ripples in the water. To onlookers, it is not a display of triumph, but of quiet intimacy, a man and a woman sharing thoughts too deep for words. Servants whisper, not of passion, but of companionship, of two minds meeting in a world full of noise. And though many still hesitate to support her openly, some begin to leave small tokens at the door of her chamber, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a handwritten prayer on parchment, a single white flower placed gently on the stone step. Not loyalty to a future queen, perhaps, but compassion for someone standing on ground that could vanish at any moment. And when she finds these offerings, she does not smile widely. She only picks them up carefully, holds them for a moment, and places them on her windowsill where the morning light can touch them. She reads the prayers silently, folds them into her book, and sometimes late at night traces the handwriting with her finger, wondering whose heart formed those words, what fears or hopes moved them to reach out in such a quiet way. Outside the palace, in towns and villages along the winding roads to London, the changes are slower, quieter, but no less real. In churches where Latin was once the only language of worship, priests begin to explain the gospel in English after Mass, speaking slowly so the elderly can follow, pausing so children might understand. Some congregations listen with suspicion. Others lean forward, eyes wide, as if hearing truth for the first time. A farmer in Kent tells his son that if God speaks to all men, then surely he must speak in the tongue they know. A widow in Norwich reads a smuggled page of scripture aloud to her neighbors by firelight, her voice trembling not from fear, but from wonder. These are not rebellions. They are awakening, small, fragile, but spreading like mist over fields at dawn. No armies march, no flags rise, but in the hearts of ordinary people, something shifts. The idea that faith might belong to them, not just to those who wear robes and hold keys to locked libraries. And in that quiet realization, a nation begins to breathe differently. Children ask questions in catechism that their parents never dared to. Old men nod slowly as they hear familiar stories told in their own words. And in the silence that follows each sermon, there is a new kind of reverence, one not born of fear, but of recognition. At court, alliances shift not through declarations, but through silences. Nobles who once stood close to the queen now find reasons to be elsewhere when she enters the chapel. Those who favor the king's path do not boast of it, but allow their presence to be felt, tending meetings, nodding at proposals, offering quiet support where it matters. No swords are drawn, no accusations shouted. But the balance of power tilts, gently, like a scale adjusting under the weight of a single feather. Even the artists at work on new portraits begin to change their approach. Where Catherine was painted with downcast eyes and hands clasped in prayer, and is shown looking outward, her gaze direct, her posture upright, not defiant, but present. One painter, working late by candlelight, adds a small detail no one requests. A book open on a table beside her, its title illegible, but its meaning clear. It is not rebellion. It is recognition. And in that silent act of brushstroke and shadow, history is rewritten not with ink, but with intention. The king sees the portrait before it is finished. He says nothing. But he returns days later, alone, and stands before it for a long time, as if seeing not just a woman, but a possibility, one that had not existed before, one that is still forming. The king himself moves through these changes like a man walking through fog, aware of the direction, uncertain of the path. He attends Mass as he always has, kneels at the rail, receives communion with reverence. Yet afterward, he asks Cranmer to stay behind. And they talk for hours about conscience, about whether a king's duty to his people might sometimes require him to act apart from Rome. He does not claim divine right, does not say he knows the will of God. But he repeats one phrase again and again, softly, as if trying it on for size. I believe it is my duty to seek the truth for myself. And in that quiet admission, something profound takes root, not rebellion, but responsibility, a sense that leadership means not just ruling, but questioning, listening, choosing. That evening, he walks alone through the library, his fingers trailing along the spines of ancient volumes, stopping at one bound in dark leather, its pages filled with canon law. He does not open it. He only stands there, breathing slowly as if listening to the silence between the lines. And when he turns away, he leaves the lamp burning, as if leaving a light on for someone who may never come. Later in his private chamber, he writes a single line in his journal. A king must serve both God and his realm. If they pull in different directions, he must find a way to walk both paths. Even the landscape seems to respond. As spring deepens, the trees bloom earlier than in memory, their blossoms falling like snow over the courtyards. The river swells with melted ice, carrying twigs and petals downstream, as if washing away the old. Children play near the banks, skipping stones, unaware that the world they will inherit is already different from the one their parents knew. A monk in a distant abbey burns a stack of correspondence in a stone courtyard, his face unreadable, the flames casting long shadows on the wall behind him. He does not weep, does not resist. He only watches until the last scrap turns to ash, then returns inside to copy a new manuscript one, written not in obedience to Rome, but in service to a king who calls himself the supreme head of the church in England. The ink flows steadily from his quill. The words are the same, but the authority behind them is changed. And in that quiet act of transcription, an empire begins to turn. Not with a shout, not with blood, but with the soft scratch of a pen on parchment, the turning of a page, the silent acceptance of a new order settling into place like dust after a storm. And yet, amidst all this movement, there are moments of stillness so deep they seem sacred. At dusk, when the light turns gold and the birds fall silent, the queen kneels once more before her altar. She lights the 3 candles, one for his soul, one for the kingdom, one for peace. This time, she leaves them burning through the night. She does not pray for herself. She does not ask for justice. She only whispers a single line from the Psalms, spoken in Latin, her voice barely above a breath. In te Domini speravi. In you, Lord, I have trusted. And in that moment, she is not a discarded queen, not a political pawn, but a woman holding fast to something no decree can touch. Outside, the wind moves through the ivy on the walls. Inside, the wax drips slowly onto the saucer. Time does not heal, but it bears witness. And in the quiet of that room, where nothing changes and everything has changed. One heart refuses to let go. She does not curse. She does not weep. She simply remains a presence in the silence, a reminder that dignity does not require a crown, that strength can stand without applause, that love can endure even when it is no longer returned. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, the world in motion, not with thunder, not with war drums, but with the turning of a page. The creak of a chair in a council chamber, the soft footfall of a servant carrying a sealed letter through a moonlit corridor. The ground has shifted, not violently, not completely, but enough that nothing will ever go back to the way it was. The air is different now, lighter, charged, full of possibility and fear in equal measure. And somewhere, beneath the surface of routine and ritual, a new England is beginning to breathe. Not born of force, not forged in fire, but grown quietly, like a seed planted in darkness, waiting for the sun to rise. And though no one speaks of revolution, though no banners fly, though the old names remain on the maps, the truth is already here. The world has turned, not with a crash, but with a whisper. As spring deepens into early summer, and the air grows thick with the scent of blooming honeysuckle along the palace walls, a new kind of stillness begins to settle over the corridors, silence not of peace, but of restraint, as if everyone in the court has learned to hold their breath between words. The king walks more often alone now, his footsteps echoing against stone floors, his shadow stretching long beneath flickering torchlight. He does not summon music in the evenings. He does not attend games or tournaments. Instead, he sits by the window of his private chamber, watching swallows dart through the twilight, their wings slicing the air with precision and grace. There is no anger in his face, no visible torment, only a quiet intensity, like a man standing at the edge of a decision too vast to fully grasp. He reads letters from advisors, turns pages slowly, sometimes rereads the same sentence 3 times without absorbing it. His hands, once so sure in swordplay and dance, now rest heavily on the table, as if weighed down by thoughts that refuse to be spoken aloud. And when he finally rises, it is not to act, but to walk through gardens, across courtyards, past rooms where lives are quietly unraveling, searching not for answers, but for a sense of balance in a world that feels increasingly off-kilter. The weight he carries is not that of a tyrant, but of someone who believes he must choose between 2 versions of duty, neither of which offers peace. In her chambers, the Queen continues her prayers with the same devotion she has shown for decades. But there is a change in the way she moves. The gestures are smaller, slower, as though each one costs more than the last. She no longer wears the crown in private, nor does she ask for royal robes. She dresses simply, in dark wool and linen, colors that blend into the shadows of her room. Her maid notices how she pauses before opening the door, as if bracing herself for something unseen, and how she no longer looks out the window toward the river, where she once watched boats carrying news from Spain. One morning, while folding a letter sealed with red wax, her fingers tremble slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort of holding still. She places the letter in a small wooden chest, lined with cloth, closes the lid gently, and kneels again. She does not weep. She does not speak. But for the first time, she leaves the prayer book open on the floor beside her, its pages facing down, as if even scripture cannot bridge the distance between what was and what is. At night, she lies awake listening to the distant chime of the chapel bell marking midnight, its sound softened by rain against the glass. She does not pray for deliverance. She does not ask for justice. She only whispers a single line from memory, spoken in the Spanish of her childhood, the voice so low it barely stirs the air. Señor, entos menos entrego me. Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit. And in that moment, she is not a queen, not a wife, not a political figure, but a woman returning to the simplest truth she has ever known. Meanwhile, Anne feels the weight of every glance, every pause, every word left unsaid. She walks through the palace with her head high, not out of pride, but as an act of survival. She knows she stands on ground that could shift at any moment, that a single misstep, a single rumor, could erase everything. So she is careful. She speaks softly. She listens more than she talks. She smiles when expected, bows when required, but behind her eyes, there is a constant awareness, like a bird perched on a branch, ready to fly. At night, she sits by the fire with a book in her lap, but she does not read. She stares into the flames, watching them twist and fade. Thinking of France, of her youth, of the women who came before her and vanished without trace. She writes letters to her family, short ones, filled with reassurances she does not feel. And when she finishes, she seals them quickly, as if afraid that leaving them open might reveal too much. No one sees her cry. But sometimes, in the earliest hours before dawn, her maid finds a damp cloth beside the wash basin, and a single hairpin left on the windowsill, as if something had been released in the dark. She dreams of dancing in a French garden under golden light, surrounded by laughter, but when she turns to speak, no sound comes out. She wakes not with a gasp, but with a slow return to stillness, as if emerging from water. When she lights the candle, she does not look at her reflection. She only watches the flame grow steady, as if willing her own presence to become just as certain. The king's council meets more frequently now, their voices low behind closed doors, the weight of each word measured like gold. They speak of law, of precedent, of the delicate balance between obedience to Rome and loyalty to the crown. No one shouts, no one accuses. But the air in the room is heavy with implication, with the unspoken understanding that they are reshaping history one sentence at a time. Cromwell presents documents with calm precision, laying them out like pieces of a puzzle. No one has yet dared to assemble. Cranmer speaks of conscience, of the right of every Christian to interpret faith directly, of kings as shepherds of their people's souls. The older bishops listen in silence, their faces unreadable, their hands folded tightly in their laps. When they leave, they do not speak to one another in the hall. They walk apart, each lost in thought, each aware that they are part of something irreversible, even if they do not yet know its name. A young clerk copies the minutes of the meeting by lamplight, his hand moving slowly, pausing whenever a phrase feels too dangerous to record. He does not burn the paper afterward. He hides it beneath a stack of tax records, not out of rebellion, but because he senses that this moment will one day be asked for. And when he blows out the candle, he does not sleep. He lies in the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, wondering if truth can survive being written down. Outside the palace, in villages where life moves with the rhythm of seasons, people begin to notice the absence of certain priestmen who refuse to repeat the new oaths, who disappeared quietly, sent away without trial or spectacle. Their churches remain open, their altars still adorned, but the sermons change. The language is clearer. The messages feel closer to home. A woman in Dorset tells her daughter that for the first time, she understood what the priest said about forgiveness. An old man in Exeter lights a candle not just for the saints, but for the king, whispering a prayer that sounds different from the ones he learned as a boy. There is no rebellion in these acts, only quiet acceptance, the slow turning of a heart toward something new. And yet, in other towns, crosses are turned to face the wall. Portraits of the Queen are preserved behind curtains, and children are taught to say her name in secret, as if honoring a memory that must not be forgotten. In a remote abbey near the coast, a monk copies the Latin Mass by candlelight, line after line, hour after hour. Not because anyone will read it, but because to stop would feel like surrender. He does not resist aloud. He does not protest. But he preserves the words, one page at a time, like seeds stored for a future season when they might grow again. At court, friendships begin to dissolve not through argument, but through distance. Women who once shared meals and laughter now pass each other in silence. Men who rode together in tournaments avoid sharing a table. Loyalty is no longer worn openly. It is hidden in glances, in the way someone holds a door, in whether they bow deeply or merely nod. No one dares to speak of betrayal, but everyone feels the fractures forming beneath the surface, like ice beginning to crack underfoot. A servant drops a tray of wine glasses near the Queen's door. No one says it was intentional, but the timing feels significant. Another brings warm milk to Anne's room every evening without being asked. These small acts carry meaning far beyond their gesture, becoming silent declarations in a war fought without swords. A lady-in-waiting who once served Catherine now serves Anne, not out of ambition, but because her family needs favor. She does her duties perfectly, never late, never rude, but when she kneels to adjust Anne's gown, her hands tremble slightly. Anne notices. She does not comment. She only says softly, "Thank you," as if acknowledging not just the service, but the burden behind it. And in that quiet exchange, something fragile passes between them. Not trust, not friendship, but recognition. The king himself begins to withdraw, not from duty, but from company. He eats alone more often, takes long rides through the countryside, with only a few attendants. Returning after sunset, his cloak dusted with pollen and dew. He visits the chapel regularly, but no longer prays in public. Instead, he stands at the back, in the dim light, watching others kneel, listening to the rise and fall of Latin chants, as if trying to remember what faith felt like before it became entangled with power. One evening, he finds a small wooden box left on his desk inside, a piece of ribbon, faded blue, tied in a simple knot. It is not signed, it is not explained, but he recognizes it instantly. A token Catherine wore on their wedding day, hidden in her sleeve. He does not call for guards, does not ask who left it, only holds it for a long time, then places it beside his bed, where moonlight touches it each night. That week, he stops attending meetings where Anne is discussed. He does not defend her. He does not condemn her. But he asks quietly that no decisions be made in his absence. And when he walks through the garden alone at dusk, he pauses before a rose bush she once planted. He touches a petal gently, then walks on without looking back. Anne, meanwhile, receives a letter from her father, written in a hand that seems colder than usual. He reminds her of family honor, of duty, of the dangers of ambition. He does not condemn her. He does not disown her. But the message is clear. She walks a narrow path, and one false step will bring ruin to them all. She reads it twice, then burns it in the fireplace, watching the edges curl into black ash. She does not cry. She does not crumple it. She only watches until nothing remains. That night, she dreams of dancing in a French garden, surrounded by laughter. But when she turns to speak, no sound comes out. She wakes before sunrise, sits up slowly, and lights a single candle. She does not pray. She does not write. She only waits for the light to return. Later that morning, she stands before the mirror, while her maid braids her hair. She does not smile. She does not frown. She only watches her own reflection, as if searching for someone she used to know. And when the braid is finished, she touches it once, then turns away, saying nothing. The silence around her is no longer just absence, it has become a presence, something she carries with her, like a second skin. And in the spaces between all of this, the empty chairs at dinner, the unanswered letters, the footsteps that stop before reaching a door, there is a kind of courage that goes unnamed. Not the kind that charges into battle, not the kind that shouts from towers, but the quiet strength of enduring, of choosing to remain present when vanishing would be easier. Catherine kneels each morning, not because she believes it will change anything, but because it is who she is. Anne walks through the halls, not because she feels safe, but because to retreat would be to surrender. The king makes decisions that will echo for centuries, not because he seeks glory, but because he believes, however uncertainly, that he must. And in their silence, in their restraint, in the way they carry their burdens without complaint, there is a dignity that time cannot erase. It is not celebrated. It is not recorded in chronicles. But it exists in the way a hand folds in prayer, in the way a letter is sealed without rage, in the way a man walks alone through a garden, carrying a weight no one sees. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, the silence between heartbeats. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not absence, but presence. The soft rustle of a robe as someone kneels in prayer. The creak of a chair as a man weighs a decision that will alter a nation. The faint scratch of a pen forming a word that could cost a life. This is where true conflict lives, not in thunder, not in violence, but in the moments before action, in the breath held too long, in the choice made in darkness. With no witnesses, no praise, no guarantee, and in that quiet, something endures, something human, something worth remembering, even as the world turns and the candles burn low. Because history is not only made by those who shout, but by those who stand still, who wait, who bear the unbearable, not with triumph, but with grace. As autumn begins to soften the edges of summer, and a thin layer of mist settles over the palace gardens each morning, quiet stillness takes hold of the corridors, as if the very stones are holding their breath in anticipation of something unseen. The king no longer walks through the great hall at dusk, nor does he attend evening music in the long gallery. Instead, he spends hours alone in his private study, where a single candle burns late into the night, its flame flickering against the dark wood of the bookshelves, casting long shadows that move like silent watchers across the floor. He reads not for pleasure, but as if searching for a sign within the pages, something in the ancient laws. In the words of the Church Fathers, in the forgotten rulings of long-dead bishops, that might justify what he is about to do. His hands rest heavily on the desk, fingers tracing the edge of a document that has been rewritten 3 times, each version softer than the last, as though he hopes to find a way to say what must be said without breaking anything beyond repair. And when he finally sets down the quill, he does not call for sleep. He only stares into the flame as if waiting for it to speak, for some invisible presence to nod in approval, for the weight on his chest to lift even slightly. But the fire gives no answer. It only burns, steady and indifferent, consuming wax as time consumes memory. In her chamber, Anne sits by the window, wrapped in a shawl stitched with tiny silver threads that catch the moonlight when it slips between the clouds. She does not read, nor does she write. She watches the courtyard below, where servants pass with lanterns, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves. She knows this night is different, not because anyone has told her, but because silence has changed. Shape it no longer feels like restraint, but like suspense. She remembers the first time she saw the king across the room, how he looked at her, not with desire, but with recognition, as if he had been waiting for someone to speak a language no one else understood. Now, years later, that same look has returned, but it carries a new weight, one of finality. She touches the locket at her throat, the one he gave her before they were married, its surface worn smooth from constant handling. Inside, a miniature painting of her face, eyes steady, lips closed. She wonders if this is how history begins, not with a shout, but with a woman sitting alone, listening to the wind move through the ivy on the wall, feeling the slow pulse of her own heart beneath her ribs. She does not pray. She does not cry. She only waits, her breath soft and even, as if preparing to step onto a bridge made of ice, knowing it may crack, but having no choice but to cross. The queen, now living in a distant wing of the palace, where the air is cooler and the light thinner, kneels once more before her small altar, the same one she has carried with her since Spain. The candles burn lower than usual, their wax pooling slowly into the saucers. She does not pray aloud. Her lips move silently, forming words too personal to be heard, too deep to be named. For the first time, she does not light the 3rd candle, the one for peace. She holds it in her hand for a long moment, then places it back in the box unlit. It is not surrender. It is acceptance. She knows without being told that the world has turned, that the man who once knelt beside her in chapel now signs papers that will erase their life together from official record. She does not curse his name. She does not weep. But she opens the Bible to a passage she has read many times, Ruth's owned, traces the words with her finger. Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. And then she closes the book gently, as if laying a child to rest. Later, she undresses slowly, folds her gown with care, and lies down without covering herself at once. Staring at the ceiling where shadows from the trees outside dance like memories, when she finally pulls the blanket up, it is not for warmth, but for the sensation of being held. However briefly, in something familiar, outside the palace, in the village nestled along the riverbank. An old priest walks home after midnight mass, his cloak pulled tight against the damp air. He does not hurry, he moves slowly, his staff tapping softly against the cobblestones, each step echoing under the low arch of the church gate. In his pocket he carries a letter sealed with red wax, dressed to no one, written in Latin, filled with prayers for both the king and the queen. He will not send it. He will not burn it. He will keep it folded beneath the floorboards of his study, where no eyes can find it. He knows that tomorrow the bishop will read a proclamation in the cathedral, something about obedience, about new oaths, about loyalty to the crown above Rome. But tonight, the stars are still the same. The river still flows. The bells still mark the hour. For these few hours before the world changes, he allows himself to remember what it felt like to serve God without politics, without power, without compromise. He pauses at the edge of the bridge, looks down at the water, sees his reflection broken by ripples, and whispers a single line from the Psalms. Not for doctrine, not for duty, but for comfort. Domini, refugium, nostrum, a generation in generationum. Lord, you have been our refuge from one generation to another. And in that whisper, he honors not a king or a queen, but the fragile continuity of faith itself. Inside the council chamber, the fire burns low, its embers glowing like dying stars beneath a layer of ash. Cromwell sits at the table, reviewing the final draft of the act, his quill poised over parchment. Making one last correction, a comma shifted, a word softened. He does not celebrate. He does not smile. He knows this document will echo for centuries, that it will break hearts, dissolve marriages, reshape faith. But he also believes, however quietly, that it may give England a future less bound by foreign authority, more rooted in conscience. Cranmer stands by the window, watching the moon rise over the rooftops. He says nothing. But his hands, clasped behind his back, tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that he has helped alter the spiritual course of a nation. When the ink is dry, the document is rolled carefully, tied with black ribbon, and placed inside a wooden case lined with velvet. No fanfare, no witnesses, just silence, thick and heavy, like snow falling on a frozen lake. A servant enters to clear the cups, notices the tension in the air, and leaves without a word. Later, in his own chamber, Cromwell kneels not in prayer, but in thought, his forehead resting against the cool stone wall, wondering if justice can ever be served without sacrifice, and whether the ends he serves are truly noble or simply necessary. That night, the king walks through the cloistered garden alone, his boots pressing into the dew-covered grass, his breath visible in the cold air. He stops before a stone bench where he once sat with Catherine during the early years of their marriage, when laughter came easily and the future seemed certain. He does not sit. He only stands there, motionless, as if listening to echoes only he can hear. Then he turns toward the west wing, where Anne waits, not in celebration, but in quiet readiness. He does not knock. He enters softly, sees her by the fire, turns to her, and says only 2 words, spoken so gently, they barely disturb the air. It is done. She does not ask for details. She does not rise. She only nods once, then looks back into the flames. There is no triumph in her face, no joy, only relief mixed with sorrow, for what has passed, for what has been broken, for what can never be undone. The king sits beside her, not close, but near enough to feel the warmth of the same fire. They do not speak again. They do not touch. But for the first time, they share the same silence, not as lovers, not as rulers, but as 2 people who have crossed a threshold together, knowing that behind them, the past is already fading, and ahead, the path is uncertain, but theirs to walk. In the days that follow, no proclamations are shouted in the streets, no banners are raised. But small things begin to shift. The royal seal is updated, not all at once, but gradually on letters, on warrants, on the margins of legal records. Portraits of the Queen are removed from public halls, not destroyed, but stored in locked rooms, covered with cloth. New sermons are preached in churches not condemning the past, but speaking of renewal, of a king guided by divine purpose. Yet in private homes, people act differently. A widow in Kent keeps a small image of Catherine hidden behind a loose brick in her kitchen. A schoolmaster in Oxford copies old prayers into a notebook, writing them in Latin, just in case. These are not acts of rebellion. They're acts of memory, quiet, persistent, invisible to those in power. A young girl finds a discarded ribbon near the palace gate, deep blue, embroidered with a Spanish rose, and tucks it into her apron, not knowing whose it was, only that it feels important. And when she dreams that night, she sees a woman kneeling in a candlelit room, her head bowed, her hands folded, and though she does not know her name, she wakes with a sense of reverence, as if she has witnessed something sacred. Anne steps into her role not with grand ceremony, but with careful presence. She attends chapel with dignity, receives visitors with grace, and speaks little in public. But when she walks through the palace, women watch her closely, not with envy, but with curiosity, as if trying to understand how someone so young could carry such a burden. One evening, a young servant girl drops to her knees before her by accident, then quickly rises, terrified. Anne stops, places a hand on her shoulder, and says only, "You need not kneel to me. Only be kind." The girl remembers those words for the rest of her life. Years later, when asked about the Queen, she will not speak of power or scandal. She will only say she looked tired, but she was gentle. Another woman, an older lady in waiting who once served Catherine, avoids Anne's gaze for weeks. But one morning, while helping her dress, she hesitates, then whispers almost inaudibly, "I hope you find peace." Anne does not reply. But later, she leaves a small book of devotions on the woman's pillow. No note, no gesture, just the gift itself. And in that exchange, fragile as a spider's thread, something passes between them, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. The king, meanwhile, returns to public life with a calm that seems rehearsed. He hosts a banquet, laughs at jokes, dances briefly with Anne, his hand firm on hers. But those who know him well notice the difference: the way he avoids looking toward the East Wing, where Catherine once lived, the way he pauses before signing documents, as if each stroke of the pen costs more than the last. At night, he walks the corridors alone, passing rooms that feel emptier than before. He does not visit the old chapel anymore. Instead, he stands outside it, listening to the chants from a distance, as if afraid of what he might feel if he entered. And sometimes, in the earliest hours before dawn, his attendants find the door to his study slightly open, the candle burned to the base, the king asleep in his chair, his head resting on a book he never finished reading. On his desk, a single page remains uncovered, a letter from Catherine, dated years ago, in which she writes of love, of service, of praying for his soul. He has read it many times. He will read it again, but he will never return it nor destroy it. He keeps it there, not as guilt, but as a reminder that some choices leave marks no crown can hide. And if you listen closely, you can hear at the turning point, not in thunder, not in violence, but in silence, in the soft closing of a door, in the rustle of paper being signed, in the breath a woman releases when she realizes her life has changed forever. This is not a moment of glory. It is not victory. It is simply the crossing of a threshold, one that cannot be uncrossed. The path ahead is no longer hidden. It stretches forward into fog, uncertain, fragile, shaped by choices made in darkness. And yet, something has shifted, not just in law, not just in religion, but in the human heart. For better or worse, the world has turned, and all that remains is to walk forward, one quiet step at a time, carrying the weight of what was lost, the hope of what may come, and the quiet courage to keep breathing, even when the air feels heavier than before. As the first frost of winter settles over the rooftops of Greenwich Palace, a quiet stillness returns to the corridors, not the tense silence that preceded change, but one that follows it like the hush after rain. When the world is damp and soft, and every sound carries farther than before, the king walks through the long gallery less often now, as if the portraits on the walls hold too many memories, too many versions of himself he can no longer recognize. Spends more time in the chapel, not kneeling, not praying aloud, but standing at the back, watching the light fall through stained glass onto the stone floor, shifting slowly with the hours. He does not seek forgiveness. He does not ask for peace. But he watches the way dust moves in the sunbeams, how it swirls and settles without purpose, and for a moment, feels something close to clarity, not about what he did, but about what it cost. There are victories written in law and power, in the new order of things. But there is also a hollow space beneath his ribs where something quieter once lived, something he cannot name but knows is gone. And though he wears ermine and gold, though his voice commands silence in every room, he feels, for the first time, a loneliness not born of solitude, but of consequence, the slow realization that some choices do not just alter history, but reshape the soul who makes them. Anne sits by the fire in her chamber, wrapped in a woolen shawl, the color of autumn leaves, her hands resting in her lap, still and pale. She is no longer watched with suspicion, nor avoided in the halls. People bow to her now, speak to her with care, call her Your Grace with voices that tremble slightly. But she feels no triumph in it. Instead, there is a growing awareness that what she has gained is not joy, but responsibility, a weight that sits on her shoulders like a crown too heavy for her neck. She remembers the early days, when the king looked at her as if she were the only person who could see him clearly. When their conversations felt like discoveries, like unlocking doors long sealed. Now, those moments feel distant, blurred by duty, by expectation, by the slow erosion of intimacy under the gaze of an entire court. She does not regret her choices, but she wonders, sometimes in the deepest hours of night, whether love can survive becoming history, whether being right can ever replace feeling whole. One evening, while brushing her hair before bed, she catches her reflection in the mirror and sees not a queen, but a woman whose eyes have learned to hide fear behind calm. And for the first time, she asks herself a question she has never dared to speak. Was it worth it? Not for power, not for position, but for the quiet truth of her own heart. The Queen, now living in a remote estate far from London, kneels each morning in a small room that serves as her private chapel. The air is colder here, the walls thinner, the candles fewer, but the silence is deeper, purer, as if distance has given her back something the palace took away. She no longer writes letters to Rome. She no longer waits for answers. Instead, she reads scripture slowly, turning pages with deliberate care as if each word must be earned. One morning, while folding her cloak, she finds a small scrap of fabric tucked in the lining, a piece of blue ribbon, faded, torn at one edge. It was part of her wedding gown, hidden years ago as a token of hope. She holds it for a long time, then places it on the altar beside the crucifix. She does not pray for vengeance. She does not ask for restoration. She only whispers, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for the years of service, for the love she gave freely, for the strength she did not know she had. And when she rises, she stands a little straighter, not because she has one, but because she has endured. Later that day, she walks through the garden, where rosemary still grows despite the cold, and picks a sprig, pressing it between the pages of her Bible, not as a memory, but as a promise to remain gentle, even in exile, to remain faithful, even when forgotten. Outside the palace, in villages scattered across the countryside, people begin to notice the absence of certain traditions, the Latin hymns sung at dawn, the statues draped in red cloth during feast days, the names of saints called upon in childbirth. These are not banned, not officially, but they fade quietly, replaced by simpler rites, spoken in English, focused on grace rather than ritual. A woman in Lincolnshire teaches her daughter to say a new prayer before bed, one she learned from a traveling preacher. An old man in York crosses himself differently now, his hand moving slower, as if relearning a gesture he has known all his life. There is no anger in these changes, no celebration, just adaptation, like trees bending under snow, knowing they may rise again when the season turns. And yet, in hidden corners, in attics, beneath floorboards, inside hollowed-out book-sold prayers are preserved, not out of rebellion, but out of love for what once brought comfort. In a cottage near Durham, a grandmother opens a wooden box passed down from her mother, takes out a small medal of St. Catherine, and places it around her granddaughter's neck. Wear it quietly, she says, and remember that some truths don't need to be shouted. At court, the rhythm of daily life continues, but the mood has shifted. Music plays in the evenings, dances are held, feasts are prepared with care, but laughter comes less easily, conversations pause more often. People watch one another closely, not with distrust, but with caution, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. A young scribe copies a letter addressed to Anne, hesitates before writing Queen, then adds it softly, as if testing the word. Later, he burns the first draft, not because it was incorrect, but because it felt too loud. Loyalty is no longer worn openly, is carried silently in the way someone holds a door, in the tone of a greeting, in the decision not to repeat a rumor. And in this quiet restraint, a new kind of respect begins to form, not for power, but for survival, for the courage it takes to remain kind in a world that rewards hardness. A lady-in-waiting who once served both queens sits alone one evening, mending a torn sleeve, and realizes she has stopped keeping count of who is in favor and who is not. Instead, she prays not for advancement, not for protection, but for the simple gift of waking up tomorrow without fear. The king, meanwhile, begins to spend more time with his son Edward, though the boy is still very young, barely able to walk steadily. He lifts him gently, holds him by the fire, speaks to him in a voice so soft it barely reaches the next room. He does not talk of kingdoms or heirs. He tells him stories about birds, about rivers, about stars seen from castle towers. He wants to believe this child will grow up in peace, that the struggles of his own life will mean something if they secure a future less burdened by doubt. But when Edward smiles at him, eyes bright with innocence, the king feels a pang not of pride, but of sorrow for all the love he has complicated. For all the trust he has broken, for the way fatherhood feels both sacred and stolen. And when the boy falls asleep in his arms, breathing slowly, face relaxed, the king does not move for a long time, afraid that even a shift might wake him, afraid that the moment might vanish like so many others. That night he walks alone through the garden, his footsteps muffled by frost-covered grass, and looks up at the sky, where the same stars that watched his youth now shine over his reign. And for the first time he whispers into the cold air, not a prayer, not a command, but a single word: forgive. Whether he means himself or someone else, he does not know. But he says it again, softer, as if offering it to the night. Anne, now visibly pregnant, walks through the garden with careful steps, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding a book of psalms. Servants greet her with lowered eyes and quiet blessings. Women whisper prayers for a safe delivery, for a son, for stability. But she hears none of it clearly. Her mind is elsewhere in France, on her youth. On the cousin who warned her that no woman could truly win in a king's game. She thinks of Catherine, not with bitterness, but with a strange kinship, as if they are two figures on opposite sides of a tapestry, both stitched into the same story without consent. One night, she dreams of standing on a bridge over a wide river, holding a candle. The flame flickers. She tries to shield it with her hands, but the wind grows stronger. When she wakes, she lights a real candle and watches it burn until dawn, not praying, not crying, just witnessing its fragile persistence. And in that act, she honors not ambition, not victory, but the quiet courage of continuing, even when the path ahead is uncertain, even when the world watches too closely, even when every breath feels like a risk. In the weeks that follow, the birth of Prince Edward brings celebration to the court bells ring. Bonfires light the hills, wine flows freely, but Anne does not rejoice as others expect. She holds her son gently, looks into his face, and feels not triumph, but exhaustion, grief, and a deep, quiet fear. She knows what happens to queens who fail to give the king what he wants. She knows what happens to those who rise too fast. And now, instead of relief, she feels a new burden, the need to protect this child, not just from illness, but from the world he has entered. When the king visits, his face radiant, speaking of legacy and divine favor, she smiles, faintly nods, says the words expected of her. But later alone, she traces the edge of the cradle with her finger and whispers, "May you never know the weight of a crown." And in that moment, she is not a queen, not a political figure, but a mother, offering the only protection she can, a silent wish for peace. That night, she writes a short letter to her sister, not about power or politics, but about the scent of milk and sleep, about how the baby's fingers curl around hers, about how, for a few hours, everything feels tender. Meanwhile, in the north of England, where snow already covers the moors and smoke rises from cottage chimneys, a former servant of Catherine sits by the fire, teaching her grandchildren to read. She uses an old prayer book, its pages yellowed, its cover cracked. She does not tell them about kings or queens. She does not speak of scandal or betrayal. But she reads aloud from the Gospels, slowly, carefully, pausing to explain words they do not understand. And when they ask why she keeps this book when others have thrown theirs away, she says only because some truths are worth remembering, even when they are no longer in fashion. And in that quiet act of teaching, the past is not erased. It is passed forward, not through power, but through tenderness. Years later, one of the children will become a schoolmaster, and he will keep that same book on his desk, not as a relic, but as a reminder that wisdom often survives not by force, but by the quiet hands that refuse to let go. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, the balance between loss and light. It's not in grand speeches, not in monuments raised, but in the breath of a woman releasing a memory, in the hand of a father holding his child, in the turn of a page read in secret. This is where meaning lives, not in victory, not in defeat, but in the quiet aftermath. When the dust has settled and the heart begins to sort what remains. Some wounds never heal. Some choices can never be undone. But within the ruins, there is learning. Within the silence, there is strength. And within the smallest acts of kindness, there is a light that no decree, no war, no passing century can fully extinguish. And though the world moves on, though names fade and palaces crumble, something endures not in stone. It's not in law, but in the quiet courage of those who loved, suffered, and still chose to be gentle. As winter deepens and frost traces delicate patterns across the windows of Hampton Court, a different kind of warmth begins to gather in certain corners of the palace. Quiet, unassuming, but persistent. It does not come from roaring fires or grand feasts, but from small moments that go unnoticed by history. A child's laughter echoing down a corridor. A book left open on a table with notes written in the margins. A servant humming an old tune while polishing silver. These are not acts of rebellion or triumph, but signs of life continuing, reshaping itself around what is past. And though the air still carries the weight of recent change, there is also something else's subtle shift. The first green shoot pushing through frozen soil, fragile but undeniable. The world has not settled yet, but it is no longer in motion. It is beginning to grow. Not with force, not with decree, but with the quiet persistence of things that take root slowly, fed not by power, but by repetition, by presence, by the simple act of being lived day after day, without fanfare, without demand for recognition. In the royal nursery where the scent of beeswax and warm milk lingers in the air, Prince Edward lies swaddled in soft linen, his breath slow and even as he sleeps beneath a canopy embroidered with golden lions. He knows nothing of power, of succession, of the prayers whispered over his cradle. He only feels safety, the gentle rhythm of a lullaby hummed by his nurse, the warmth of a hand resting lightly on his chest. Yet around him men already speak of him in hushed tones, as heir, as hope, as the living proof of a new order. His birth has done what years of debate could not. It has given legitimacy to a reign built on rupture. But in this room, far from politics and proclamations, none of that matters. Here, he is not a symbol. He is a child. And in his quiet breathing, in the way his tiny fingers curl around a blanket, there is a kind of peace that no decree can command, no crown can claim. A maid watches him from the doorway, her hands folded, her face softened by candlelight, and for a moment she forgets who he is meant to become. She only sees a baby, vulnerable and perfect, and in that forgetting, she offers a silent prayer not for greatness, but for gentleness, for a life where love comes easier than duty. Anne watches him from the doorway, wrapped in a velvet robe lined with fur, her steps silent on the thick carpet. She does not enter. She only stands there, one hand resting against the frame, her eyes tracing the rise and fall of his chest. There is no pride in her gaze, no calculation. Only a deep, quiet wonder at how something so small could carry such weight, at how love can bloom, even in soil marked by loss. She remembers holding her daughter, Elizabeth, just months after her birth, feeling the same tenderness, the same fear. And now again, she holds her breath, not knowing what future awaits this boy, whether he will inherit peace or conflict, wisdom or sorrow. But for now, he sleeps. In that sleep, she finds a moment of stillness, a rare gift in a vita bio constanta escrutinio. Later, alone in her chamber, she opens a small box where she keeps a lock of Elizabeth's hair, tied with blue thread. She touches it gently, then closes the lid, not out of sadness, but reverence for motherhood, for memory, for the fragile continuity of a woman's love across time and silence. Beyond the palace walls, In quiet rooms lit by candlelight, scholars begin to translate more of the Bible into English, their hands steady despite the risk. They do not publish loudly. They do not seek fame. But they pass copies carefully from one trusted reader to another, each page handled like something sacred. A schoolmaster in Gloucester reads passages aloud to his students, explaining words like mercy and truth in ways that make them feel personal, immediate. A widow in York teaches her grandchildren to read using a smuggled leaflet filled with psalms, her voice soft but firm. These are not revolutions. They are root systems growing beneath the surface, unseen, unhurried, but spreading steadily. And though no one speaks of reformation in the streets, the idea that faith might belong to the people, not just to those who wear robes and hold keys, begins to take shape not in fire, but in silence. In a village near Exeter, a man copies a single verse onto a scrap of parchment and tucks it inside his coat, not to defy, but to remember. And when he places it beside his bed each night, he does so not as a rebel, but as a man seeking comfort in a language he finally understands. At court, new customs emerge so gradually that few notice when they began. Women are seen reading more often, not just devotional texts, but histories, poetry, even philosophy. Some keep notebooks where they write their thoughts, not for publication, but for themselves. A lady-in-waiting asks Cranmer a question about grace during a chapel service, not out of challenge, but curiosity. He answers gently, without rebuke. And in that exchange, something shifts not in doctrine, but in permission. It is no longer assumed that only men may interpret Scripture, only priests may question, only kings may decide. The air feels lighter, as if a door long sealed has been left slightly ajar, letting in a draft of fresh thought. A young scribe, copying letters late into the night, adds a line of his own beneath the official text. Every soul has access to God. He does not sign it. He does not show it to anyone. But he leaves it there, like a seed planted in darkness, waiting for sunlight. The king, meanwhile, walks less through the gardens and spends more time in council. Not with war plans, but with architects, scholars, and theologians. He listens more than he speaks. He asks questions about education, about how the poor might be taught to read, about whether churches could serve as centers of learning. He does not claim to have answers, but he repeats one phrase again and again, softly, as if trying it on for size. A kingdom should serve its people. And though some advisors exchange glances, unsure of where this path leads, others begin to draft proposal schools funded by dissolved monasteries. Sermons preached in English, books printed for common use. These ideas move slowly, like rivers finding their course, but they move. And in that movement, the first outlines of a different England begin to appear, not born of conquest, not forged in blood, but grown quietly like ivy climbing a wall, one tendril at a time, reshaping the stone without breaking it. Jane Seymour, though she never lived to see it, becomes a quiet presence in memory. Her portrait hangs in a smaller hall, not among the great rulers, but near the private chapel, where light falls gently on her pale face. Servants speak of her kindly, not because she was powerful, but because she was gentle. A maid recalls how she once stopped to help a child who had dropped a tray, not scolding, not ignoring, but kneeling to pick up the pieces. That story spreads, not as legend, but as truths, small, unremarkable, yet remembered. And in that remembrance, Jane leaves behind not policy or reform, but something deeper, the quiet example of kindness in a world that often rewards hardness. Years later, a young girl in the countryside will hear that story from her grandmother, and when she grows up, treat her servants with dignity, not because of law, but because of a whisper from the past. And in that chain of unseen influence, Jane's legacy lives on not in monuments, but in manners. Meanwhile, Anne of Cleves arrives in England, not with fanfare, but with caution. She is not beautiful in the way the king expected, not dazzling in the manner of French courts. But she carries herself with a calm dignity that surprises those who meet her. She does not seek favor. She does not complain. When the marriage is annulled, she accepts it without protest, retires to a country estate, and lives in peace. And though history will call her the ugly wife, those who serve her know otherwise. She is wise, generous, deeply observant. She hosts gatherings not of nobles, but of scholars and musicians. She supports the printing of religious texts. She protects women who find themselves without protection. And in her quiet life, she proves that survival is not failure. It can be its own form of strength. No statues are raised in her name. But in the homes of those she helped, her name is spoken with gratitude, long after the others have faded. And when she dies, surrounded by friends, she is buried not in a royal tomb, but in a peaceful churchyard, where children play nearby and flowers grow wild over her grave. Back in the north, where Catherine of Aragon spent her final years, the villagers who served her continued to light a candle in the local chapel every Christmas Eve. They do not call her divorced. They do not say she was cast aside. They call her the Spanish Queen and tell stories of her kindness, her devotion, her unwavering faith. A priest writes her name in the church register beside the list of benefactors, though no law requires it. And when travelers ask why, he says only, because some people leave more than titles behind. And in that quiet act of remembrance, her legacy is not erased by official records, but preserved in the hearts of those who saw her not as a political pawn, but as a woman who held fast to what she believed, even when the world turned away. One winter, a young girl kneels before that candle and whispers a prayer for courage. She does not know Catherine's full story, but she feels something in the silence and carries that feeling forward, unnamed, unbroken. And if you listen closely, you can hear it the legacy, not in speeches, not in battles, not in gold, but in the turn of a page, the tone of a voice, the way a mother teaches her child to pray in a language they both understand. This is how change truly takes root, not with force, but with patience, not with noise, but with repetition. Not in one great moment, but in thousands of small ones, each adding weight to the next. The king may believe he has reshaped a nation with laws and decrees, but the real transformation happens elsewhere, in classrooms, in kitchens, in quiet rooms where people dare to think for themselves. And though no one can see it yet, the seeds planted in silence are already growing, reaching toward a light they cannot yet imagine. They do not rush. They do not boast. They simply exist, quietly, insistently, changing the earth beneath them one root at a time. As the years pass slowly, like leaves drifting down a quiet river, the sharp edges of what once felt urgent begin to soften. Worn smooth by time, distance, and the gentle persistence of ordinary life, the palace remains, its stone walls standing against wind and rain. But the voices that once filled its corridors grow quieter, fading not into silence, but into memory. No one speaks of those days with anger anymore. No one shouts names in the hall. Instead, the story is told in hushed tones, late at night, by servants tending fires, by elders teaching children how things were before the world changed. It is not a tale of triumph or tragedy, but of people, real hearts, real choices, real breaths drawn in rooms long since fallen still. And though the official records speak of laws passed, of marriages dissolved, of power shifted, the deeper truth lives elsewhere, in glances remembered and letters never sent, in the way a woman once knelt in prayer and did not rise until dawn. The air in those old rooms feels different, not colder, not emptier, but heavier with presence, as if every decision made there left behind a trace, like dust motes suspended in sunlight, visible only when the light falls just right. And sometimes, when a door creaks open after decades of stillness, it carries not a sound, but a feeling, a whisper from the past, asking only to be acknowledged. In the village where Catherine spent her final years, the seasons continue their quiet cycle. Snow covers the fields in winter. In spring, crocuses push through the frost. The chapel still stands, smaller than it once was, its roof repaired many times over, its bell rung only on Sundays. But every Christmas Eve, without fail, a candle is lit near the altar, placed there by an elderly woman who remembers serving the Queen. She does not know all the politics, all the disputes between kings and popes. She only knows that Catherine was kind, that she asked after the sick, that she never raised her voice, even when the world turned cold. And so, year after year, the candle burns not as protest, not as devotion, but as remembrance. And when the flame flickers in the draught from the door, it casts shadows on the wall that look for a moment, like the silhouette of a woman kneeling, head bowed, hands folded, still praying long after the world has stopped listening. The priest who tends the chapel does not mention her name during Mass. He does not write her title in the register. But he places a sprig of rosemary beside the candle. Her favorite herb. Anne says nothing. And in that quiet act, something sacred is preserved. Not in doctrine, not in law, but in the simple continuity of care across generations. At court, the portraits remain on the walls, though dust gathers in the corners of their frames. Anne's image hangs in a narrow gallery, not among the queens of old, but near a window where morning light touches her face for only a few minutes each day. Servants who pass do not linger, but sometimes a young maid stops, looks up, and notices something others have missed. The way Anne's eyes seem to follow her, not with judgment, but with understanding. She does not know the full story. She has heard fragments that this woman loved fiercely, spoke boldly, fell swiftly. But in that gaze, she sees something else, a warning, perhaps, or a companion in solitude. And when she walks away, she carries with her not fear, not gossip, but a quiet respect for someone who dared to be seen, even when it cost her everything. Years later, when she becomes a mother, she will tell her daughter about the lady in the painting, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that courage is not always loud, that strength can live in the way a woman holds her chin, in the way she refuses to look away, even when the world demands it. Meanwhile, in a distant abbey, where monks copy manuscripts by candlelight, an old priest opens a leather-bound book filled with chronicles of the reign. He turns to the pages about Anne Boleyn, reads the official account, her rise, her fall, her execution, and then closes the book slowly, placing it back on the shelf. But later, alone in his cell, he takes out a private journal, much smaller, its cover worn from handling, and writes a single line. She believed in truth more than safety. He does not sign it. He does not date it. He only hides it beneath a loose stone in the floor, knowing it may never be found. And yet he writes it anyway, not for history, but for conscience, as if bearing witness is enough, even if no one ever hears. That night he kneels before a small crucifix, not to pray for forgiveness, but to ask for clarity, to understand how a kingdom could break itself over love, over faith, over the refusal to remain silent. And when he rises, he does not blow out the candle. He leaves it burning, as if keeping vigil for all those whose stories were erased too quickly. In London, where the river flows steadily beneath gray skies, a schoolmaster teaches his students about the Tudors using a printed text approved by the Crown. He speaks of the king's wisdom, of the birth of the Church of England, of the peace that followed. But when a child asks what happened to the first queen, he pauses, looks out the window, and says only, "She stayed true to what she believed." He does not elaborate. He does not name her. But the way he says it softly, deliberately makes the children remember. And years later, one of them will tell the same phrase to their own child, not as fact, but as feeling, passed forward like a lullaby hummed across generations. Another student, a girl with dark eyes and a quiet voice, asks why some women are forgotten. The teacher does not answer. But that evening he adds a footnote to his lesson plan, written in pencil, barely visible. Catherine of Aragon, loyal, devout, never ceased to love her husband or her adopted land. And in that small act, history is not rewritten, but gently expanded, one soul at a time. Elsewhere, in a quiet estate in the countryside, Anne of Cleves lives out her days in peace, surrounded by books, music, and the company of those who value her mind more than her title. She never remarries. She never seeks return to court. But she writes letters to former ladies in waiting, offers shelter to women in need, and supports the printing of religious texts in English. When she dies, she is buried simply, without fanfare, in a churchyard where roses grow wild over her grave.
How grand!
No grand monument marks the spot. Oh, but those who knew her place flowers there each spring, not because they are required to, but because they remember her kindness, her dignity, her quiet refusal to become bitter. And in that unbroken tradition, her legacy lives on, not in law, not in bloodline, but in the way gentleness can endure longer than power. A century later, a traveler passing through the village will find the grave overgrown, but the roses still blooming, and will ask who lies there. An old man replies, a wise woman. She chose peace, and that is enough. The king himself grows older, heavier, slower. His step falters. His voice, once so commanding, now breaks occasionally, as if tired of carrying so many words. He walks less through the gardens, spends more time by the fire, staring into the flames as if searching for faces in the smoke. He does not speak of the past. But sometimes, when music plays in the great hall a lute, a familiar melody, he closes his eyes. And for a moment, he is not a ruler, not a legend, but a man remembering a time when love felt possible, when choices seemed clear, when the future was not written in sorrow. And when he opens his eyes again, there is no regret in them, no apology, only a deep, quiet weariness, as if the weight of a lifetime has finally settled into his bones. One evening, while turning the pages of an old book of poetry, one he wrote as a young man, he finds a pressed flower tucked between the sheets, its color long faded. He does not throw it away, places it back carefully, closes the book, and sets it on the table beside his chair. And for the rest of the night, he sits in silence, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, as if waiting for something he can no longer name. And in the east wing of the palace, where Elizabeth grows under careful watch, no one speaks loudly of her mother. But the governess who raises her teaches her Latin, history, theology subjects, once considered too serious for a girl. She gives her books, encourages questions, allows her to write essays on faith and justice, and when Elizabeth, still small, asks why some people say her mother was wicked, the woman kneels beside her and says, "Some truths are not spoken aloud, but you will learn them in time." And in that moment, the past is not erased. It is protected, hidden within education, within thought, within the slow shaping of a mind that will one day rule not with force but with intellect. As the girl grows, she begins to write poems, to compose music, to study the stars. And though she wears a mask of composure in public, in private, she traces the initials A.B. in the margins of her notebook, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. And in that quiet act, Anne's spirit lives on not in vengeance, not in glory, but in the quiet brilliance of a daughter who refused to be silenced. Years later, long after the king is gone, long after the palaces have changed hands and new rulers sit on the throne, visitors come to Hampton Court and walk through the same corridors where so much was lived in silence. They do not hear footsteps. They do not see ghosts. But sometimes, in the stillness between tours, when the last guide has left and the doors are closed, a visitor will pause near a window, feel a cool draft move through the room, and turn, as if sensing something just beyond sight. They cannot explain it. For a moment, the air feels different, fuller, as if holding its breath. And though they walk on, they carry with them a strange sense of presence, as if the walls themselves remember and choose, in their own quiet way, to whisper. A child runs ahead laughing, and suddenly stops, looking back down the hall. "Did someone call me?" they ask. No one did, but the parents exchange a glance, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the past, though unseen, is never truly gone. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, the settling of memory, not in thunder, not in stone, but in the soft rustle of a page turned in an old book, in the creak of a floorboard underfoot, in the way a single candle burns a little longer than it should. This is where history truly lives, not in dates, not in battles, not in crowns, but in the spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet places where love, loss, courage, and endurance gather like dust in sunlight. Unseen, unhurried, but impossible to fully erase. And though the world moves on, though names fade and empires crumble, something remains, not as noise, but as echo, not as command, but as invitation. To remember, to feel, to honor what was lived, even when no one is watching. Because every life, no matter how broken, how forgotten, how lost to time, leaves behind a vibration, a whisper that continues to breathe in the present, waiting only for someone willing to listen. As the world turns and centuries fold into one another like pages of an ancient book left open to the wind, the lives we have walked through tonight do not vanish. They settle, not into dust, not into silence, but into the quiet spaces between moments, in the way a woman pauses before speaking her mind, in how a man chooses kindness over power, in the courage it takes to believe in something when no one else does. You may never hear their names in a classroom, may never see their faces in a painting, but you feel them like a draft beneath a door, like the scent of rain before it falls. They are here not as ghosts, but as echoes, woven into the fabric of how we live, how we love, how we endure. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your breath, you can sense them still close, familiar, alive in ways that time cannot erase. The past is not behind you. It breathes beside you. It moves with you, in the soft rhythm of your chest rising and falling, in the way your heart hesitates before making a choice that feels true, even when it is difficult. In a classroom far from England, a young girl sits by the window, her notebook open, her pen moving slowly across the page. She is writing about leadership, about power, about what makes a ruler worthy. Around her, students talk of conquests, of armies, of laws. But she writes something different. A leader should protect those who cannot protect themselves. Her teacher reads it and nods, says nothing. But later, she copies the sentence onto a card and places it on her desk, where it remains for years. The girl does not know it, but her words echo something spoken long ago in a palace chamber, by a queen who knelt in prayer while the world turned against her. It was not a law, it was not a decree, it was a belief. And now, centuries later, it moves forward, not in stone, not in title, but in the heart of someone who has never heard Catherine's name, yet carries her truth. And when that student grows up to lead others, she will not remember this moment. But she will act from it, guided by a quiet certainty that dignity is not granted by rank, but earned through compassion, a thread passed forward not by blood but by example. Elsewhere in a hospital at night, a nurse walks softly down a dimly lit corridor, checking on patients who sleep fitfully under thin blankets. She stops at one bed, adjusts the pillow, wipes the brow of an elderly woman who murmurs in her sleep. There's no urgency, no reward for this act, but she stays a moment longer than necessary, holding the woman's hand until her breathing slows. She does not think of queens or courts. She does not know the story of Anne Boleyn, but in her quiet presence, in her refusal to treat suffering as routine, there is a kind of rebellion, one not against kings, but against indifference. And though no one will write of her in history books, her compassion becomes part of the same thread that once ran through a woman who dared to speak when silence was demanded, who believed that dignity was not given but claimed, and in that simple gesture repeated thousands of times across hospitals, homes, and shelters. Anne's legacy lives on not in titles, not in revenge, but in the quiet insistence that every life matters, especially when it seems forgotten. In a library where sunlight falls across wooden tables, a scholar opens a fragile manuscript copied by hand in the 1530s, its ink faded, its margins filled with notes in careful Latin. He is not studying war, not researching battles or treaties. He is tracing the evolution of a single word, conscience. He follows it through letters, sermons, legal documents, watching how it grew from a private whisper into a public right. And as he reads, he realizes that this idea, this belief that each person could interpret faith for themselves, did not appear suddenly like lightning. It grew slowly, quietly, fed by small choices. A priest translating scripture, a king questioning authority, a woman reading alone by candlelight. He closes the book gently, places his hand on its cover, and feels for a moment the weight of all those silent acts that made thought free. And in that stillness, he understands. Revolution does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes it begins not with a battle cry, but with a woman choosing to read a book others said she should not touch. In a courtroom, a judge listens to a case about marriage, about rights, about whether love must conform to law. The room is modern, bright, filled with technology. But as she weighs her words before speaking, she thinks not of statutes, but of balance between duty and desire, between tradition and change. She does not mention Henry VIII. She does not reference the Tudors. But in her hesitation, in her care, there is a trace of that old question, asked in a different time. Can a life be reshaped in search of truth? And when she rules not with rigidity, but with mercy, she honors not a king or a queen, but the long, slow journey toward justice. One that began not with a verdict, but with a doubt spoken in a chapel long ago. Later, alone in her chambers, she looks out the window at the city lights below and wonders if anyone will remember her decision. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that she chose fairness over fear. And in that choice, she continues a lineage of quiet courage that began in a palace where a man once asked himself if he had the right to follow his own conscience. At home, a mother tucks her daughter into bed, smoothing the blanket, brushing hair from her forehead. The girl asks, as she often does, "Were people happy back then?" The mother hesitates, then says some were, some weren't. But many tried to be brave. The child thinks for a moment and replies, "I want to be brave like that." The mother smiles, kisses her forehead, and leaves the door slightly open, letting light spill into the room. She does not know that her daughter will grow up to defend the rights of others, to speak when it is difficult, to stand in rooms where few like her have stood before. But in that simple exchange, in that quiet wish passed from one generation to the next, something continues not as command, not as legacy, but as seed. And years later, when that girl stands on a stage receiving an award for her work, she will not think of palaces or crowns. But deep inside, she will carry the echo of a bedtime conversation where bravery was not loud, not heroic, but gentle, patient, and chosen without fanfare. In a museum at dusk, after the last visitors have left, a guard walks slowly through the gallery where a portrait of Anne Boleyn hangs. He does not linger. But every evening, without fail, he adjusts the small light above it, ensuring her face is not lost in shadow. He does not do it because he is told to. He does it because something in her eyes erect, unafraid, full of thought speaks to him. He has read her story. He knows how it ended. And yet he sees not tragedy, but defiance. And in that gaze, he finds strength when his own days are hard. No one sees him do it. No record is kept. But the light remains. Night after night. A small act of preservation. Not of art, but of meaning. And in that quiet ritual, he becomes part of a chain much older than himself, a line of unseen guardians who keep memory alive, not through speeches, but through attention, through care, through the simple act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Meanwhile, in a quiet village church, an old man lights a candle, not for himself, not for the dead, but for peace. He does not pray aloud. He only sits, hands folded, breathing slowly. He thinks of his wife, gone 5 years now, of his children, living far away, of the world that feels louder, faster, less kind, and in the stillness, remembers a story his grandmother once told him of a queen who loved her country, who stayed true even when abandoned. He does not know if it was true, but it felt real. And so, year after year, he keeps the ritual alive, not out of duty, but out of connection to her, to the past, to something deeper than memory. And in that candle's flame, flickering gently in the dark, 2 lives touch across time, not through blood, but through feeling. And though no historian will note his name, his act becomes part of the same current that flows through all remembrance. The quiet refusal to let love disappear just because the world has moved on. And if you're listening now, close your eyes and breathe deeply. You might feel it too, the presence of those who came before, not as distant figures, but as companions in the quiet. Perhaps in the way you choose patience over anger, in how you protect a secret dream, in the courage it takes to keep going when no one applauds. You do not need to wear a crown to carry their strength. You do not need to change a nation to honor their sacrifice, simply by being gentle when hardness is expected, by thinking when silence is preferred, by loving when fear would be easier. You continue what they began. Not with force, not with fame, but with the quiet persistence of a heart that refuses to close. And in that choice, you become part of history not as a name in a book, but as a living echo carrying forward what mattered most. The belief that a single person, standing quietly in truth, can shift the world in ways no sword ever could. Because history is not only written in books, It lives in choices, in glances, in the way a hand is offered, a word softened, a truth spoken in the dark. And though the palaces crumble, though the names fade, though the world forgets, something remains a vibration, a breath, a whisper that travels through time, not in thunder, but in tenderness. And tonight, as you prepare to sleep, know this: you are not separate from the past. You are part of its echo. You are where it lands. You are how it continues. And somewhere in the quiet beyond waking, they whisper back, you are not alone. You are remembered. What you choose tonight in the silence matters more than you know. As the last echoes of this long night in the Tudor halls settle into silence, you can let go now and allow your breath to slow even more. As if each exhale carries a little less weight than the one before, as if the air itself were growing softer with every passing moment. The story has been told, not with urgency, not with drama, but with care, like a letter folded gently and placed into your hands at the end of a quiet day. And you have carried it this far, walking through gardens touched by frost, standing beside candlelit altars, listening to hearts that beat centuries ago, feeling the presence of lives lived in courage, in love, in silence. You did not need to change anything. You only needed to be present, and that was enough. If you came here seeking peace, I hope you found a moment of it within these words. If you came carrying thoughts too heavy for the day, I hope they feel lighter now, as though a window had opened somewhere deep inside, letting in a cool, steady breeze. This is what stories have always done, not fix the world, but soften its edges, just for a while, allowing us to rest beneath their quiet canopy. And if, somewhere between the first word and the last, you felt a quiet connection to Catherine's dignity, to Anne's courage, to the silent strength of those who loved and lost, you are not alone. Because history is not only about what happened, it is about how it still feels. And tonight you gave space to that feeling, and in doing so, you honored those who lived it. Thank you for trusting this voice, for closing your eyes, for letting an old palace breathe again in your imagination, for staying until the very end. Thank you for listening from wherever you are, in a city wrapped in light, in a village under open stars, in a room where rain taps softly against the window. Wherever you are, know that you are seen, even in the dark, and that your presence here matters more than you may realize. And if you'd like to share where in time or space you're listening from, I would love to hear your whisper, but if not, that's all right too. Sometimes the most meaningful things are felt, not said, and simply being here has already been a gift. And when you're ready, let yourself drift. Letting the images fade slowly, the torches along stone corridors, the portraits in shadowed halls, the faces of those who once walked these paths with hopes and fears just like your own, they will rest now as you should. There is no need to remember every name, every turn of the path, every choice made in silence. Only to know that you were here, that you listened, you allowed yourself to feel something soft, something deep, something true, and that in itself has value beyond measure. And if one day you want to return, if you'd like to walk another corridor, hear another story, dream through another century, this voice will be here, waiting in the quiet, ready to guide you once more through the shadows of time. Through the hush of forgotten rooms, through the gentle breath of history, resting beneath the surface of the world, let your body sink deeper into comfort, feeling the warmth of your blankets like a gentle embrace. Feeling the support of the surface beneath you holding you completely, allowing every muscle to release its tension without effort, without thought. Let your mind wander without direction, following no path, chasing no idea, simply floating as if carried by a slow river beneath a sky full of stars. Let your heart slow to the rhythm of rest, matching its beat to the quiet pulse of the night, to the distant sound of wind outside, to the stillness that grows with every breath you take. Sleep well, knowing that you are safe, that you are held, that you are part of a story much larger than any single life. Woven into the same fabric of time that carried those who came before you, the world can wait. It will be there when you wake, unchanged in its motion, but you may find that you have changed, ever so slightly, just by having listened, just by having been here, just by having allowed yourself to feel the weight and the wonder of what once was. And so, with gratitude, with calm, and with a quiet heart, I leave you now, not goodbye, but good night.